Jazz activist Ira Gitler was wearing a downbeat t-shirt and listening to Art Tatum with his wife of 46 years, Mary Jo Schwalbach, when he died at the age of 90 on February 23, 2019.
I first met Ira Gitler when I started writing for Downbeat in the late 70s, and he was really affable and encouraging. About 20 years later, on the eve of his 80th birthday, I spoke to him about Ray Charles.
And it wasn't a big apartment, it's a tiny apartment, but Ira had so many CDs and records. Like the CDs were in this little tiny courtyard, all packed up in tubs, like Rubbermaid tubs or something.
Ira's crib was a warehouse of jazz memorabilia that he had collected during his distinguished career, and a lot of Mary Jo's artwork. We spoke about his life in jazz.
Jazz was just natural to me when I first heard it. I just absorbed it.
It touches a part of my life, it touches my heart and soul, and just animates my soul in a way that very few things in this world do.
Coleman Hawkins playing Body and Soul made me cry the first time I heard it. It was so beautiful. I guess it just touched something in there.
But Ira would probably be the truest writer of all, seriously. When he gave you a review, I don't think he always looked for the best in you and found out what you did that he liked. Not what he disliked, but what he liked.
You know, he was very positive in most of his writings, and musicians liked him because he said nice things about them.
In my junior year, the guy who was doing the jazz column, can you imagine that? The high school newspaper had a jazz column. Well, he graduated, so he had been ahead of me, and I guess, yeah, I was a junior when he was doing the column as a senior. So I was recruited to do the jazz column, where I imposed myself. The first piece I wrote on jazz that was published was Dizzy Gillespie at the Spotlight, 1946.
1945, when I came out of the service, Ira was a young kid. Talking to him, it wasn't phony. It was like I was talking to one of my musician friends who really knew Bert.
I think, you know, he was one of the first writers to champion bebop, and he was particularly in love with Charlie Parker. I mean, he took up the alto, which he never succeeded in. And, you know, I don't think he would blame me for saying that he never got to play it very well. But it was just another expression of his passion for Bird and for bebop.
You know, I actually got to play with Ira once, and it was an event at the New School, and they had all the critics who wrote were going to play. So Dick Sudhalter played the trumpet, I played the tenor, Whitney Balliet played drums, Bill Crow played the bass, Ira played the alto. And the funniest thing was, in the front row, Jimmy Heath and Clark Terry were sitting there with notebooks. Like, it was really great.
We drove down to the session. It was at Apex on West 57th. That's where a lot of jazz recording was done in those days. And that's when Stan did Long Island Sound. That was the first record date I actually went to.
The thing about Ira that was so appealing was his real love for the music. People call us critics or whatever, but I think he looked upon himself as a kind of elevated fan.
He was in the trenches. You know, it seemed like he knew the musicians, he knew the music, he was there, and this is what happened.
In '50, I left school. Bob asked me to work at Prestige. I would pack the records, unpack the records, and sweep the floor. Visit DJs with the new releases and write label copy, write ad copy for the ads in Downbeat. Go to a lot of the sessions, and by PRLP 117, which was a Zoot Sims session, where he broke the minute barrier by just closing his eyes and going on and on. And Bob said, "You're the writer, write some notes. I'll make you famous, man." And that was it.
Through the records and the record bins, and then turn them over and realizing that the great majority of stuff that you would encounter was drivel. And then there were a handful of people that you would start to read, say, "Oh, not only is it not drivel, but it's good. And not only is it good, but I'm actually learning something." And then you would get to the point where you would actually be looking to read the liner notes. You didn't care so much about who was on the record. I'm talking in the record store. And just sit there and get an education. I mean, the record store was like a library. So that's when I became aware of the name of Ira Gitler.
Started seeing his name on the back of albums, particularly prestige albums. I was reading him, in downbeat and reading his liner notes. So he became a very large luminary in my cosmos, in my jazz cosmos. He was a hero before I even knew him.
Going to the Jazz Record Mart, which I discovered on my 17th birthday. They were having a big sale. I went right down when I saw the advertisement. I fell in love with this place. And that's where I could stand at the record bins reading the liner notes by Ira. I mean, really principally, because the Nat Hentoff notes that I got a lot out of, they were on the inside of those Impulse jackets. Ira's were on the outside.
So I had once on one of our trips, I had been just, high-fiving him on the sheets of sound. I said, "Isn't it great, man? You got a phrase that's going to outlive you." Or you coin a phrase that becomes like this standard part of our lexicon. And, I congratulated him and he thanked me and all that. And then we started talking about a very progressive saxophonist in the early 80s. Who flirted with the avant-garde and all that. And we were talking about him. He was a darling of that era. And Ira was laughing because he said that guy wasn't about sheets of sound. That guy was about the sound of sheet. And I thought, that's very, very artful turn of a phrase, Ira, the sound of shit. And so he was funny because he took his very own creation, he morphed it out and just made it even more of a thing for me to process.
Miles did Dig and Denial and Paper Moon and that whole session with Sonny and Jackie McLean. And Sonny played so well that day, despite squeaking a few times. The reed was giving him trouble. I guess Bob was finally convinced, and he offered him a contract. And the first date was in December, and Bob, as I said, didn't want to go in the studio anymore for a period of time. And he said, you do the session. Can you imagine that? Here I am on the eve of my 23rd birthday, producing Sonny Rollins.
Get in the time machine and go back and go to Minton's and see Charlie Christian and Charlie Parker and Monk, and Bud Powell and all these great musicians. Well, he was there. He knew all of these guys.
Sonny concocted this mambo bounce, which was a mambo rhythm blues coming out of the head, though it went into 4/4. It was a little tricky, and they just couldn't get it. And so we did many takes, and I had been to some sessions, so I had some idea of what went on at a session. And I said, let's forget this for a while and go on to some other thing. Kenny was nodding out at the piano between takes, and Art Blakey would play his famous press roll ending in a crash, and Kenny would come up from the piano. It was kind of nasty of Art, but he was getting a kick out of it. There was some rough times for him. He didn't have a neck strap. made one out of a wire hanger and some rope. And finally, we got through Mambo Bounce. It wasn't quite smooth transition, but we got it. It was my indoctrination and his first as a leader.
Downbeat in those days, it was really a great place to learn about the music. I mean, it was written for the jazz fan, but if you were an entrance level beginner, you could learn a great deal from the reviews and the feature articles and stuff. And those were, you quickly learn the guys whose taste is similar to yours. Ira was, definitely one of those guys.
I go back to the year 1959 or 1960, so I was either 14 or 15. And one of my favorite records, or my favorite record at that time, was Cannonball Adderley live in San Francisco. Cannonball Adderley Quintet with a great tune, Dis Here, on it. And one of my father's favorite records was Time Out by Dave Brubeck. And Ira gave both those records 2 stars, maybe 2.5 stars for Cannonball, complaining about the really sarcastic reviews too. Funny, but sarcastic. So I got really mad at him, even though I had never met him. But I remember reading those reviews. I was in a drugstore and I got all PO'd. He was a good-natured guy. The next issue, there was a picture of Cannonball and Dave Brubeck strangling him. So that was really my most vivid recollection of his wit, so to speak. In fact, there are all 3 of those guys. They were all great guys.
You want to be able to react, try to get inside the music. In the early days of writing liner notes, we used to describe every song, which necessarily you don't have to do, but that's one method. I know it helped DJs a lot. The challenge is always to try to be yourself, get into the musician you're talking about and what makes he or she unique.
I ended up producing a Paul Bley concert at Town Hall in New York around 1968. And afterwards, we all went to Don Preston's loft. I was sitting in a circle with Barry Altschul and Ira.